They told us morality came from the West, that civilization came wrapped in treaties, aid packages, and social reforms. But Africa is waking up and realizing that morality imposed from abroad is not morality at all. It's management. It's control dressed up as compassion. Across the continent, from Burkina Faso to Uganda, from Niger to Ghana, a quiet revolution is reshaping the moral map of Africa. Not with guns and slogans, but with the courage to say no. No to imported ideologies. No to psychological colonization. No to policies that insult the intelligence of a sovereign people. When Western diplomats talk about partnership, what they often mean is obedience. Aid tied to values, loans tied to lifestyles, recognition tied to compliance. It's not diplomacy, it's behavioral conditioning. And for decades, African elites went along. They thought playing by those rules meant progress. But the new generation of leaders has learned the truth. The West's version of morality is just another export, and it's time for Africa to close that port. Take the rise of Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. Whatever one thinks of his methods, it's undeniable. He speaks the language of sovereignty, not submission. He doesn't ask for approval from Paris or Washington before protecting Burkinabe interests. That alone makes him dangerous in the eyes of the global establishment. Why? Because he represents something far more contagious than rebellion: moral independence. When Traoré says Africa must define its own destiny, he's not just talking about military strategy. He's talking about spiritual liberation, about ending the centuries-old narrative that Africa's values need foreign supervision. Because for too long, Western governments have treated African societies as cultural laboratories, testing grounds for new social norms, gender doctrines, and governance experiments that even their own citizens often reject. Now let's be clear, Africa isn't rejecting human dignity, rights, or justice. Those principles are deeply rooted in African tradition. What's being rejected is ideological imperialism, when nations thousands of kilometers away dictate what should be sacred or profane within African borders, when aid budgets become weapons to enforce conformity, when ambassadors behave like missionaries, scolding entire countries for choosing paths different from theirs. And here's the irony: Western nations that preach tolerance often show none when Africa asserts its own moral compass. The moment an African government chooses sovereignty over social engineering, sanctions come knocking, funding gets frozen, and the media chorus begins: authoritarian, backward, anti-democratic. The pattern is predictable, but this time, Africa is not blinking. Look at the Sahel Alliance: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. These nations are redefining independence in real time. They've expelled foreign troops, restructured foreign aid, and rewritten diplomatic alignments. But the deeper shift isn't military, it's moral. They're telling the world, we'll decide what progress looks like. Thank you. And that's the core of this moment. Africa isn't isolating itself from the world, it's isolating hypocrisy. The continent has seen how Western morality bends depending on interests. When an ally violates rights, it's called strategic partnership. When an African nation asserts control over its own economy, it's a threat to stability. Africans see the double standard, and they're done playing polite. If you're still watching this, you probably feel that same fire, the sense that Africa's time is now, not when someone else says it is. So go ahead and hit that like button if you're tired of the lectures and ready for leadership rooted in truth, culture, and strength, because that's the movement unfolding before our eyes. Let's take a moment to unpack what's really behind these Western social policies. Whether it's the conditioning around education, family, gender, or media narratives, these aren't neutral humanitarian programs. They're soft power strategies. They shape societies from within, not through tanks or coups, but through curriculum, cinema, and corporate funding. And once those values take root, economic leverage follows. It's cultural occupation without a single soldier. But Africa is catching on. Nations are passing laws that reaffirm local traditions, faith structures, and communal ethics. Western media calls it regression. Africans call it self-respect. Because here's the truth: sovereignty isn't just about borders, it's about identity. A people who don't control their moral compass can't claim to be free, no matter how many flags they raise or elections they hold. Remember when African leaders were told democracy would solve everything? Decades later, many realized democracy without dignity is just dependence with better branding. What's the use of elections if every policy is still written in Washington or Brussels? What's the meaning of freedom if it's conditional on adopting someone else's worldview? The shift we're seeing now is psychological. It's Africa saying, we'll define our values even if that means losing your funding. And that's terrifying to a system built on dependency. Because once Africans no longer need external approval, the entire architecture of neocolonial influence collapses. Western institutions have invested heavily in shaping Africa's moral narrative through NGOs, media campaigns, and development initiatives. But as sovereignty takes root, those narratives are losing traction. People are asking real questions. Why should our cultural policies come from foreign think tanks? Why should rural communities be forced to accept norms that clash with centuries of tradition? Why should our parliaments be told what is modern or acceptable by countries that barely respect Africa's voice on the global stage? The conversation is shifting fast. In 2023, when several African nations rejected externally driven social policies, Western diplomats responded with moral outrage, as if Africans had broken a universal law. But the truth is simpler. Africans are tired of being told that morality flows in only one direction. And the beauty of this awakening is that it's not orchestrated from above. It's rising from communities, youth movements, and cultural leaders. It's not about copying the past. It's about reconnecting with ancestral balance, where morality meant harmony, not hierarchy. In many African societies, moral order wasn't about domination. It was about duty to family, to land, to truth. Those values kept civilizations alive long before colonization and will outlast Western experiments in social engineering. What's happening now is a reclamation, a reminder that Africa's moral heritage never needed external validation. But make no mistake, this awakening threatens powerful interests. Western NGOs that once dictated policy through grants and capacity building now face resistance from leaders who say, "Thanks, but we'll fund our own future." And that's the real panic. A continent stepping out of the moral leash. Because when Africa stops seeking moral permission, it stops being manageable. And when it stops being manageable, it starts being free. Freedom, however, is not granted. It's built, brick by brick, with conviction and sacrifice. That's the phase Africa has entered now. The reconstruction of its own moral architecture. Not the borrowed one, not the imposed one, the one forged from the continent's lived experience, its faith, its culture, its collective memory of resistance. In the halls of power from Ouagadougou to Bamako, you can sense the shift. Policy is no longer just about economics. It's about dignity. It's about reclaiming the authority to say, this is who we are, and this is what we stand for. That's why the most powerful weapon against neocolonialism today isn't military might, it's moral clarity. Because when a people rediscover the legitimacy of their own values, they become politically unstoppable. Let's be honest, Western powers aren't panicking because of African poverty. They're panicking because Africa is redefining progress. Because for decades, progress was supposed to mean imitation, copying Western institutions, Western economies, Western lifestyles. But what happens when Africans decide progress means sovereignty? When a nation values cultural continuity more than compliance, that's the revolution no sanction can contain. You can see it in the way African youth are responding. They're not waiting for foreign NGOs to define their causes. They're creating their own platforms, their own movements, rooted in African pride, African problems, African solutions. They see that the real question isn't whether Africa is developed enough, but whether Africa is independent enough. And that's shaking the very foundation of Western influence, because moral authority has always been the core of soft power. For centuries, the West positioned itself as the moral compass of the world. But that compass has rusted. Wars waged in the name of peace, exploitation in the name of aid, manipulation in the name of partnership. The mask has slipped. Africa sees it. The world sees it. And no amount of polished rhetoric can hide that hypocrisy anymore. When Western politicians lecture Africa on human rights while arming factions in other regions, when they speak of democracy while supporting coups that serve their interests, Africans recognize the contradiction. It's not morality, it's management by another name. And now that system is being rejected at its roots. You can hear that rejection in the speeches of leaders who refuse to apologize for African identity. They speak not as vassals seeking validation, but as custodians of civilizations older than Europe itself. They remind the world that Africa doesn't need saving. It needs space to breathe, to choose, to rebuild. And this isn't just happening in politics. It's in the culture, in art, in education. African filmmakers are rewriting narratives that once portrayed Africa as chaos. African philosophers are revisiting indigenous ethics that value community over consumption. Even in economics, there's a shift towards self-reliance, local industries, regional trade, currency sovereignty. The pieces are aligning slowly but surely toward one vision, a continent in control of its destiny. Still, the road is brutal. Every step towards sovereignty invites resistance, from outside and within. There are elites who still cling to foreign validation, afraid that independence will cost them privilege. There are institutions still addicted to foreign funding, too timid to think beyond donor expectations. But the tide is rising, and no bureaucracy can stop a moral renaissance once it begins. Some critics say this wave of African moral assertiveness is isolationist, but that's a misunderstanding born of arrogance. Africa isn't isolating, it's insisting on fair partnerships, mutual respect, and ideological freedom. The continent isn't saying no to the world, it's saying no more to being patronized. And if you look closely, even some Western citizens are starting to agree. They see how their governments lecture others while failing their own people. They see through the theater of moral leadership. The difference is, Africa is doing something about it. This isn't just politics. It's a shift in consciousness. Africans are realizing that morality cannot be outsourced. It must come from within, from history, from elders, from spiritual traditions that have guided communities for millennia. A moral order rooted in balance, not domination, in reciprocity, not reward. Think about it. Before colonial borders, African societies had intricate systems of justice and ethics, councils of elders, communal accountability, restorative justice. These were not primitive customs. They were sophisticated frameworks that valued human dignity long before the word democracy entered the continent. Colonialism didn't bring morality, it disrupted it, and now Africa is piecing it back together. When leaders like Traoré talk about sovereignty, they're not rejecting modernity, they're redefining it. They're saying modernity must serve the people, not the other way around. That's why Western elites call them radical, because they expose a truth the global order can't digest. That moral legitimacy no longer resides in old empires, but in the nations bold enough to think for themselves. You can feel that energy spreading across the continent, a quiet confidence that Africa owes no moral explanation to anyone. The same nations once lectured about corruption are now teaching lessons in courage. The same societies once dismissed as undeveloped are showing what integrity looks like in an age of hypocrisy. This right here is the end of Western moral dominance in Africa, not through anger or revenge, but through maturity, through the calm, resolute assertion that Africa will walk its own path, even if it walks alone for a while. But Africa won't walk alone. The global South is watching, Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, each recognizing their reflection in this struggle. What begins in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, could very well redefine the global balance of moral power. So, as the world watches, Africa's message is simple. We are done being lectured by those who confuse control with virtue. We are building a future grounded not in imported ideals, but in ancestral wisdom and collective destiny. If that vision moves you, if you believe in an Africa that defines its own ethics, its own future, then don't just watch. Share this message. Let it spread from village to capital, from diaspora to continent. Because this is more than a political movement, it's a spiritual awakening. And no empire, however powerful, can suppress a people who have remembered who they are.